Hello, global gardeners. Happy Monday. It's time to start your gardening week. We'll be answering a lot of questions today. We'll be giving you some information about gardening ideas, and we'll use today as a day of remembrance. This is Memorial Day in the United States. This is a national holiday to commemorate those who have lost their lives while serving in the United States military. And I think the garden offers a great opportunity for all of us to spend some time. It's a place of solace, a place where we can remember those that are dear to us and maybe those that we never knew. I want to dedicate today's show to Steve. And some of you may know that Steve from the Green Side Up YouTube channel passed away last week. And he had a huge impact in a number of UK YouTube channels and UK gardeners. And while he wasn't as well known for those of us in the United States, his was a channel that I watched and I learned from Steve. And it's tough when someone that you think you know, or at least would like to know, passes away before you had the opportunity to know them better. Steve and I had actually chatted about having him on this live stream. And so I'm not only sad for his family and for everyone who knew him, but I'm sad that we all lost the opportunity that we could have had if Steve had been able to join us. So today's show is for Steve. And of course, today's show is for all of those who might be in our mind on a day like today as we move forward with our gardening discussion. And I want to share with you over the course of the show today some of the things that I have done and continue to do to remember those who are dear to me in my garden. And I'm asking you as well to share some of what you do to make your garden a special place for those memories. Let's go ahead and answer a couple questions. Prepper Chris is saying, I know blueberries like acidic soil. My soil's around 6.5. Can I add half sphagnum peat moss and half potting soil to the whole? Will that work? Saw your vid. Please help. And so peat moss is acidic. And problem is it varies depending on the source of the peat. It runs typically 3.5 pH to about 5.5 pH. So it can acidify soil. What you need to be more aware of is your specific soil makeup. So if you have an alkaline soil, and if it's alkaline because it has a lot of limestone in it, that's one of the reasons that can lead to the alkaline soil. There are a lot more mineral components in that limestone that will work against the acidifying factors in the peat moss. And so while peat moss will lower the pH, it tends to be short term in soils that are alkaline like that, because the overall soil that has that limestone component, or maybe there's some clay associated with it, is going to buffer the effect of the peat moss. And probably in about a month, you may not even notice that the pH is as low as it was when you first put the peat moss in, and it'll return to its normal baseline that the limestone is creating. So in a pot, the peat can be much more effective at lowering and keeping the pH low, but generally in open soil, it's just a short-term effect. So still, as I show in that video, the best way to acidify your soil is by adding sulfur to it, and that will give you more of a long-term impact. It's because of the way the minerals are working, you really need that long-term mineral component to change your pH. Moondust is saying, my seedlings didn't do so well, so I direct sowed to the garden. How late is too late for bush champion cucumber, summer squash, lettuce, kale, and beefsteak tomatoes? And so whenever you direct sow your seeds, it all comes down to how long your growing season is and how long it takes for those plants to reach harvest. Now, I still have not direct sown my summer crops. My soil temperature is still just too cold. Maybe next week I'll be able to start putting some of those seeds in the ground. And I have a pretty short season, about 130 days. And so as I look at my garden, it's not too late for me for the plants like the cucumber and the squash and the lettuce and the kale, because those type of plants are usually harvested in the 70, 80, or 90 day range. And so if your season is long enough for that, and mine is, it's not too late. And so bring those factors into play whenever you're trying to decide when to direct sow. Now, as far as putting out a tomato plant, it probably is too late for tomato seeds, for even for those of us who might be in warm regions. But if you have a beefsteak tomato plant, it's the same discussion. How long will it take for that beefsteak tomato to reach maturity and harvest? And some beefsteaks are 100 or 110 days to reach that point. And if your season is long enough, yes, you can still do it. It's not too late. For me, it's really gambling when I try to grow beefsteak tomatoes, because everything has to be right, and most of the time it's not. So I don't grow beefsteak tomatoes. I just go ahead and go straight to the plants that I know will work well, like the cherry tomatoes, and just accept that my season isn't long enough to do those beefsteaks. So how long is your season? How long does it take the plant to reach harvest? And that should give you a pretty good answer. So let's see, go ahead and scrolling down to catch up. Go ahead and throw your questions out there. And I see that In the Garden with Eli and Kate is with us today. So nice to have you here. And so I will point out, and you'll probably see this on In the Garden with Eli and Kate's channel. And I've also already seen some videos from a number of UK channels as they remember Steve from Green Side Up. You'll see, and this is the thing I want to point out for Eli and Kate, in the background in a number of these channels, you'll see some of those little memorials that gardeners have set up for Steve and for many others. And so if you watch the UK videos, or if you're in the UK and you're familiar with Steve, I'm sure you'll start seeing many more of those videos pop up. And I think it's a great way to remember the people that are dear to us. YouTube essentially lives forever with these videos that we make. And so that's one way to express your care and your concern and your loving, is to make a video about it. And you don't have to be a highly successful channel with hundreds of thousands of subscribers. If you've never made a video on YouTube before, this might be one of those things to consider. If you have a loss and you want to have a remembrance that you can look at in years ahead, and you can share with other family members, a simple YouTube video may be one of those things to help you overcome some of that grief. So something to think about as we move forward. Garden of Whedon says, I've bought myself a Hori Hori tool, so every time I use it, I can think of Steve. That is perfect for what I want to talk about today. Steve had so many wonderful videos. He had a couple different allotments. He had a number of polytunnels. He was always out in the garden showing the tools he's using. And Hori Hori is a great tool. But yes, if you can have a tool that brings to mind the individual that may have first exposed it to you or taught you how to use it, it's a great way to remember that person. So I really like that idea of tools that others have passed on to you. I've done that as well. I had a tool, I've actually kind of stored it away because it was getting old, but I had an old shovel that was passed to me by a gardener friend years ago, and every time I used that shovel, I remembered that gardener. So that's definitely one of those things to think about, and I really, really like that idea. in the garden with Eli and Kate says, very true. Steve was such a big figure here in the UK, so there will be so many of us remembering him this weekend. That's nice. And Yankee Sister Homestead, I've planted a bleeding heart in remembrance of my husband. I love that idea. I have violas that I grow to remember my grandmother. I have a number of little plants around the garden that may really not be noticed, but I notice them. And so for Yankee Sister Homestead, I really like that idea. Having the plants in your garden and you just walk by and you remember them. My lilacs are blooming right now, and oh, the fragrance is just so incredible. And every time I smell that, I think of my grandmother. Not because my grandmother grew lilacs, which I think maybe she might have, but because of her perfume. She had a perfume that had that lilac fragrance to it. And so I think of my grandmother every time I smell the lilacs I have. So bleeding heart is a wonderful plant of remembrance. And thank you for sharing that. It's definitely one of those things that it's individual for each of us in choosing what the plants are and where those plants will go. And don't think that it needs to be for anybody but yourself. And that's how I approach my gardening. Now, sometimes you can actually build a memorial in your garden. So a number of years ago, my wife and I planted a tree. And as we were planting that tree, she actually blended in some of the ashes of her mother and her father in that planting hole. And then we had a marble stone that we placed next to that tree. And so that tree was a memorial to her parents. And we knew that. Some of her family members knew that. Anyone walking by down the street wouldn't know that, but that wasn't the point. That was our memorial tree for her parents that she lost many, many years ago. And so a formal place in your garden for that type of memoriam is easy to do if you just put your mind to it and figure that it is something that you want and then something that you can put into place. Dusty Flat says, I made a flower pot for my sister, but she passed away before I got it to her last Monday. Oh, sorry to hear that. So it's her memorial now. There you go. I love these ideas. These are great ways to move forward in our garden and still have those memories. Gardens Happen says another important thing to remember are our pets. And that, I've talked about this in the past, and this is one of those things that I'm planning for my garden as well. So I have my pets, and I have actually saved the ashes of my garden pets, and I'm planning on building a memorial spot in my garden with the ashes of my garden pets that have been such wonderful friends in the garden for so many years. So yes, it doesn't have to be the people that we remember in our special spots as we walk through the garden. I definitely have spent more time in my garden with my animal friends than I have with my people friends. And so they deserve a place in my garden because they've definitely earned it. So thank you, Gardens Happen. I think that's a wonderful thing to do. The Ladies Garden at Home, I have a remembrance card for my aunt with strawberries and blueberries, her favorite dessert, and a bright red geranium in the middle, her favorite flower. Awesome. Awesome. That's the kind of thing that again, someone visiting your garden would see that and say, oh, that looks really pretty, but you're the one that knows why it's there, and it has definitely special meaning for you. Quiet Space Arts has a memorial in the garden for our pet fishes that pass. I like that idea too. For any of you who had goldfish in particular with your kids, there's usually that grave site where you bury the fish and you have a little ceremony. And I like that idea, especially for kids. That can be one of those things to help them overcome some of that grief. Love to Garden has a spot for pets with beautiful plants around it. So wonderful. So wonderful. I appreciate that idea. Joe's Crayon says, Happy Memorial Day. I'm very sorry I haven't showed up in a while. I was working a lot. Don't worry about that. However, I bought some fresh corn and had lots of it growing outside. So glad you're with us today, Joe's Crayons in our garden show. And for everyone, don't worry if you miss a show or miss a month or miss any time. I love having everybody here on Monday, and I know so many of you like being here as well. And you can always catch up with replays in the shows and see what it was we talked about. But so I'm glad that you are here and with us today. And Britt Lee says, that's amazing, Governor Scott. I want to do that also with my loved ones' ashes. And so traditionally for many of us, cemeteries and grave sites are where we go for remembrance. And so just last month on one of my trips, I visited my grandfather's grave who died 50 years ago, just over 50 years ago. And he was in the Air Force, and it was a national cemetery. And I went and visited his gravesite. And it was a special moment, somber. I remember him, even though I was quite young. I still remember some of the things he taught me, and have tried to live my life to what I think his expectations would be. Those spots are needed. Those spots are part of our culture, but that's not saying that you necessarily should or have to put all of your attention into a cemetery or a grave site. We can just have these little spots in our garden. And so my grandfather in particular, I hadn't really thought in terms of creating a spot in my garden. But after having visited that national cemetery, it got me thinking that for not only that grandfather, but all of my grandparents who I've lost, of having something, and my thought at this point is a bench. I love having sitting areas in the garden. And so I'm thinking about building a bench, and that will be my grandparents' bench. That'll be the spot when I sit on that bench to observe the garden. That's the bench that I'm building to remember all of my grandparents. And so flowers and pots and trees and all of those things can play into how we all choose to remember it. But even just a spot, a bench where we can look at everything that's moving forward around us is also something that for me at least, will act as a source of remembrance. So as I do that, I will probably do a video about it. We'll see. I'm not sure how private or public that may end up being when I finish that project, but it is one of those things that I do have a specific goal in mind with that specific remembrance in my garden as one of those things I want to do. So Robin's Container Garden, so nice to have you here. Another one of our UK families. Sorry I'm late. I had a plant rescue in the poly greenhouse. We certainly need a way to remember those who are special to us in our lives. The garden's a great place for this. Completely agree. And so glad that you can join us. Hope the rescue was successful in your greenhouse. That's so nice. I've been relatively lucky. You'll see it in videos that are coming. My greenhouse is actually saving a number of my plants. We've had such high winds and we've had thunderstorms most days. I've been trying to harden off for over a week now, and I haven't been able to leave any of the plants out for more than about 3 or 4 hours because the weather moves in. So all of my plants are in my greenhouse right now to continue the hardening off process, and that's how I'm rescuing them from the terrible weather that we have. Riverdale Gardens, nice to see you here today. My younger brother, who passed unexpectedly 4 years ago, was the one who convinced me to make my first raised an old canoe. I think of him often while tending it. I like that idea. The reuse of things that family members have given you that you can have life growing in the garden. That's a nice idea. Jay's saying, I have been working on getting a bench installed in the only shady location in our community garden. Many of the gardeners get overwhelmed by heat and fatigue. Wonderful idea. That's so nice, Jay. Yeah, benches, you'll see this. That's one reason why I like going to botanic gardens and city gardens, because it really gives you that perspective that we don't always think about. When we're working in the garden and we get hot, we'll sit down and maybe under a tree or go in the house and cool down. But in big gardens in particular with benches, the benches are almost always in the shade. And so when you add benches to your garden or to a community garden, yeah, finding a shady spot is a great idea. So I think that's a wonderful goal, Jay. I hope it works out well for you. Dusty Flats says, my folks had a sign with our last name on it. We placed it on the garden gate. They get the whole garden. That's so nice. That's a wonderful idea. I have a few things like that as well. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I've got some little signs like that I keep in my memory boxes in the closets, but they deserve to be brought out and put in the garden. So how about you? Do you have memory items like that you have just stored in some closet somewhere? Go ahead and bring them out. Show them the light of day. Put them in your garden and add that to your memories that grow every time you garden. Sherry is saying, I'm looking at building a small bridge and painting it rainbow colors. It would be a memorial for my pets who have passed. Thank you for that, Sherry. I'm trying to figure out how to do that. That's what I want to do with my pet memorial in my garden. That's how I'm envisioning it, is to have a little water feature and then have some type of little rainbow bridge. And then on the other side, having just a little grassy area with some rocks surrounding it. And in that spot is where I'll mix in their ashes as I put that grass in. So yes, I'm also thinking of Rainbow Bridge as a way to remember our pets. So thank you for sharing that idea, because that is a very symbolic way of remembering our pets. For those of you who don't know it, I would suggest you do a search on the Rainbow Bridge poem about losing our pets, and they cross that rainbow bridge. It's a beautiful poem, and it really is one of those things that I think once you read that poem, and once it affects you, because it will affect you, it now becomes part of your garden planning. If you have pets in your garden, is always thinking about that rainbow bridge. Two Gals says, I have an herb garden sign that was my mother's. I bring it out every year. The herb garden is hers, with a lovely red heart. So that's a nice idea. I hadn't really thought much about that, because I do have so many areas for memories in my garden, but I really do need to bring out some of those signs and some of those things I have. So I'm so glad we're talking about this, because this is giving me a lot of ideas as well. Bud Jenkins says, I have 2 engraved rocks placed under a palmatum maple that memorialize my son's dog and my daughter's cat that were part of our family for many years. That's wonderful. That's special. I like that idea. I think I may carry that forward. I'm planning to see my granddaughters today, and they lost one of their dogs last week, who the dog is actually older than they are, and so it's been part of their family for their entire lives. And they like to do projects with rocks, and so if they haven't already done that, I'm going to suggest that they paint some rocks for Doc, their lovely dog that passed last week. So that's a wonderful idea. Thank you, Bud. Moondust says, I've been making a lot of plans for a garden when I move. I want to make the center of my garden as some form of a shrine for my nature goddess and horn god status with a wood path. When we plan our gardens, I like that idea. I'm doing a center part of my garden as well. I've designed my whole garden around the center. Now, my purpose is different than yours, but absolutely, if you have that opportunity to design a garden from scratch as you move to a new place, definitely keep in mind what you want that garden to say to you. And starting from the center and then working out in that design, I think is really a good way to start. I talk about that almost 4 years ago now when I first moved to this house. And actually, it'll be 4-year anniversary here in just a couple days. And the first thing I did was just walk my property, and then I started putting the plan together, and it's all built around that center spot. And that'll actually be one of the last things that I build. All the plants go in, and then I'll build the structure in the middle of the garden. But it's all built around, or it's all designed around that structure. And so that's a great way to approach design when you move to a new place. Sunset Gazing says, I have Turk's cap that is from cuttings that my grandmother had. Oh, that's nice. That my mom had, that I now have. Rose of Sharon's that my aunt had, that I planted at my mom's and dad's, and I now have from cuttings. I like this idea too. We've been talking about having the structure, the bench, the rock, the tree, the ashes, but sometimes the plant itself is a fantastic way to pass on those memories from one generation to the next. So think about that. If you have a special plant that means a lot to you, share it with those around you. That could be the next generation to grow that plant, and tell them the story. Tell them what's so special about that plant, so that years from now, when they share the cuttings from the plant, they can share the same story. So thank you for that. That's a wonderful idea, passing on cuttings and keeping it going. And then they continue. They've all passed, so I think of them, especially when the pollinators and hummingbirds enjoy them, and a young crepe myrtle on forming into a certain shape, as my dad did over 45 years ago. That's fantastic. And especially if you can start early, and if you're forming a tree, if you're creating a hedge, whatever it happens to be, some of these things take a long time to become established. And so go ahead and get them started now. And someone may be talking about what you did 45 years from now because of some of the things that you start as early as you can. So I really like that idea. Sonia Moran, most of my personal friends know my garden by name Prayer Garden, in remembrance of my husband. He was a retired disabled vet, a true hero to me, and I do have a spot for my retired pets. Peaceful. Oh, that's so nice. I like that idea of a prayer garden. And the whole point to all this is you can set up your garden however you want. And so a prayer garden as a theme for that whole space, that's fantastic. And you're doing it for yourself. That's all that matters. That's all that matters. So keep that up. Keep those design ideas coming, because I think this is really helping for a lot of us. Jay saying, Aria Garden Memorial, I gave yellow bean seeds to a senior who grows it annually in memory of a relative who loved them. Oh, I like that idea too, Jay. You don't always have to do it in your own garden. Go ahead and pass those seeds to others to continue going. Isn't this great? These are some wonderful ideas. Green leaf gardening, have a great idea. We make area for remembering something. And when those plants die, you make a memorial for those plants. And when those plants die, make a memorial for those plants. So yes, that could be an endless cycle. I think the garden in general just becomes that on a yearly basis for many of us. Karen Saraf says, my mother has included both a religious statue and a memorial plaque in our backyard gardens. I've seen a lot of that, and I think that's one of those things. A lot of garden centers I've seen more and more are starting to sell plaques and statues to put in the garden with more religious meaning to them. So if you have that thought and really don't know where to get them, go check out your local nursery, and that may be an easy solution to setting up some of these memorial spots that you're unsure of what you want to do. Yeah, check out the nursery, then you might get some good ideas there. Dusty Flats has mock orange and catalpa trees, memories of where I grew up, and I have them in my yard now. It's strange the mock orange was a small plant from the previous owner. It's ready to bloom. Can't wait. it's so nice. It's a little serendipitous that the lilac bushes that I have came with the house. And I had lilacs at a house 2 houses ago. And at that house, I remember thinking of my grandmother when they would bloom. And so sometimes when others do the work for you, that helps bring some of those memories up. And because I didn't plant lilacs at my last house, so I was really pleased to have them here. It really makes a difference. Sherry says, I used to belong to an antique rose society, and we often gave each other cuttings of roses that had a century or more of history. That's fantastic. That's a big reason why I like growing some of the heirloom plants that I do. It's because of the story behind the plants. And that's why I suggest if you give seeds, and if it is for a specific memory, make sure you share that story, because the story should be passed along with the plant, with the cutting, with the seeds. And I just think that makes it so much more memorable and so much more important when the story goes along with it, especially cuttings of antique roses. That's a wonderful idea. Bud says, I appreciate this session's topic because it acknowledges that our gardens are more than botany. They have an emotional element for each of us. I completely agree, Bud. We do spend a lot of time choosing the plant, planning our garden, trying this thing, trying that thing. And sometimes I think we lose sight of what gardens are to us. It's okay if it's just a food production space and you're not intending to do anything more than just grow plants and eat those plants. But as you get older, and I'm speaking from experience here, as you get older, you spend more time in your garden thinking about how you got to that point that you could sit in your garden. And that's why for me, it really is a space for something other than just the botany, something other than just the plants. It's the emotions that those plants evoke and the memories that all the garden entails when it comes to putting those plants in the ground or building the beds or having your grandkids wander through and pluck off those pea pods and eat them. That's a big reason why I garden. And I think that's one of those things that we should all keep in mind as we get out into our gardens today and every day. Quiet Space Art says, I acknowledge everyone's grief and like to send my warmest, gentlest hugs to all. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, this, is one of those days, and Memorial Day is basically a holiday weekend in the United States. There are sales at the stores and people travel. It's the unofficial start of summer vacation all over our country. And it's easy to lose sight of the intent of this holiday. This holiday is intended to commemorate those individuals who lost their lives. And so life gets in the way sometimes, and we forget the purpose behind a holiday like this. And that's why I wanted to share some of these thoughts today, where we go beyond just a single day. We go beyond just this holiday and really try to make every day a way that we can commemorate those that are dear to us. And so today is the day for the military, but there's no reason why tomorrow can't be the day for your grandmother or anyone else that you have that's special to you in your garden. So it's so nice that you're all here and can share this time with us. Melissa Martin says, I have a wooden pelican made by my grandfather probably 40 years ago for his garden that has a place in my garden. I remember it from my childhood, and it definitely comes with so many memories. That's nice. That's a great way to share with others who you can tell about what that pelican is and why it's in your garden. And I hope you have the opportunity to pass it on in your later years as well, and that the stories will continue. So that's fantastic. Oh, moon dust, interesting. After the stream, I'm going to look up on how to carve names into stones. I like that idea. I've thought about doing that. I actually have some of the tools for carving into stone, and just haven't done it yet. It's on my list. Maybe I should revisit that list and do more with that. So thank you so much for reminding me of some of the things to do. Britt Lee built a garden for my nephew. It has and is completely healing for me. It is a sacred spiritual place for me. Means more than words can describe, really. Grateful was able to, or Gardner Scott, grateful was able to because of you. So that's nice. Yes, the garden is so healing. I did a video about that a few months ago about the healing effects of the garden. And I really do believe that as well. It really can be a healing place. And whatever it is that means to you in your garden is what you should move forward with. Absolutely. Gardens Happen says, in my high school, there was a wing for severely handicapped students and had a memorial garden for those who passed. I like that idea too. You'll see that sometimes at like hospitals or nursing homes. I haven't really seen much at schools, but I really like that idea. So thank you for sharing that as well. So yeah, Sherry says for carving, use a Dremel. And that's what I have. I have one of those handheld Dremel tools with the stone tip, stone grinding tip. And that's exactly what I'm planning to do when I start carving my stones. I just haven't got to it yet. So thank you, Sherry. That's a great idea, a great suggestion for the way to carve stones. I've done that with wood. I did some practice with some wood, and it takes some practice to get it right, but that's definitely something to think about as you move forward. Missy T. Garden Delight says, I usually watch your videos later while in my garden. This is my first catch alive. Hello all. Well, thank you for being here. Glad that you could be here live. I know there's a lot of people that literally thousands of people that aren't able to be here live that do catch it in replay. And it's always nice to welcome everyone here for the first time. So nice to have you here, Missy T. And I hope you get the opportunity to join us in the future. Hey, Jay is on top of it. Jay and Heidi are our fantastic moderators, and she's got a link for carving letters in stone. So thank you for that, Jay. I'm going to have to come back and click on that link later and see what it has to say. It's one of those, you can find all kinds of information on YouTube. So I appreciate you putting that out there. Quiet Space Art says, I have fibro and arthritis, and garden helps me physically and mentally. Here in Orkney Hospital, we have 3 polycrubs for community to use. And so that's nice. So thank you for sharing that. And I'm so glad your garden helps you physically and mentally. Definitely does me. You know, there are days when I'm just sore and just don't want to get up. And I know that there's work. And I don't mean not get up like out of bed, like I'm sitting in my chair and I'm nice and comfortable and I just don't want to get up and go work. And then I get outside and the pain just fades away. And I can spend hours in my garden and feel great physically and mentally. And that's one reason why, because so many of us are spending so much time in our garden, having the different sections of your garden that evoke the different emotions and the different memories, that helps with that physical and mental well-being, because it takes you away from some of those physical and mental pains and takes you to a happy place in your mind. So that's one of the things that I like to use when it comes to designing my garden and building my garden out. I'm always looking for those kind of things. Wayne Sal says, we have a garden dedicated to Lorraine's dad. Thank you for Memorial Day session. That's nice. And so I think a dedicated spot for parents is definitely something to consider. And so give my best to Lorraine. I think that's a wonderful idea. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and scroll down. If you've got gardening questions, this is wonderful. This is absolutely wonderful. But this is a time of year, if you've got some issues that you want to know about your plants, by all means, feel free to ask some of those questions too. Deb C says, my dad gave me some iris about 20 years ago. He passed away about a year and a half ago, and I've taken some of those iris and planted them at his gravesite to share them back with him. Oh, that's really a nice idea. Yeah, the opportunity to have that kind of come full circle, that's a nice idea, Deb. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, I know I'm falling behind a little bit, so I'm going to scroll down. Yeah, there's an explanation of the polycrubs. It's a windproof polytunnel, and I assumed it was a polytunnel, but didn't not to necessarily say that. So thank you for clearing that up a little bit. I was going to have to go back and see what the polycrubs were really all about. T. Nugan says, our VA Medical Center has a garden where families can buy a stone to commemorate their fallen veterans. The money is used for the upkeep of the garden and contributing to our homeless veteran programs. That's nice. And that's, I like that idea. The stones really are a great way. So whether they're painted or, like, I think a number of us are going to learn how to inscribe on stones today, but having them in a garden, especially when it can support the garden, that's a nice idea too. So thank you for sharing that. JB Walker is saying, rain forecasted the next 8 days and nights in northern Colorado around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 11.5 Celsius. I haven't transplanted my garden. I have peppers, herbs, pumpkins, cucumbers, loofah, birdhouse, gourds. When can I plant? And so I feel your pain. It hopefully is soon. I was hoping to get much of my garden in this week with my plants and my seeds, and I'm waiting till next week because I'm in central Colorado and we don't have as much rain forecast. We've been having rain, but there are cooler days coming. It's finally warming up to the point that I can get the plants outside, but it's going to be too cold to keep those plants outside in just a couple days, these crazy roller coaster temperature extremes here in Colorado. So I would like to give you a specific date, JB, but right now I'm targeting the second week of June. That's what happened last year. Last year I didn't get my tomatoes and peppers and most of my garden set until the second week of June. Had a successful season. Everything was wonderful. Had good harvests. It just wasn't as early as I hoped. So hold on a little bit. You can always get a jump on the season with hoops and plastic and start some of your seeds and plants under that. But with this forecast here in Colorado for the next week, it's probably going to be at least a week before you can get your plants going outside. Will it grow? Welcome. I'm here in the Northeast Cape Cod, and this year my growing zone changed from 6B to zone 7A. Did you ever get a zone change in your state? Yes. In fact, you can expect that much of the United States is going to be changing zones here officially very soon. And so I'm in 5B right now and expect to be changing to 6A. Doesn't necessarily mean that you can have big changes with how you garden. The hardiness zones are determined based on historical data over usually about 30 years of meteorological data, and it is all about the coldest average temperature, or the average coldest temperature in winter. And so the winter temperatures have been rising across the United States, and so that's why you're going to see zone changes for many of us. But you can still get really cold temperatures. And so, for instance, in zone 5B, that means my average lowest temperature is minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. That's minus 26 Celsius. And so while over the last 30 years, that average low has increased, this last winter, I had a day with minus 15 degrees. The year before, I had a day with minus 15 degrees. And so you can still get some of those extreme lows. It's just on average, those lows aren't going to be as low as often. And so I'm still hesitant to do much in the way of automatically throwing out all my Zone 5B plants and buying nothing but Zone 6 plants. I'm still going to be growing as though I'm in Zone 5 until things stabilize out a little bit more. And so, yeah, you can expect Will It Grow for a lot of discussion to be coming on about that in the months ahead, and with a USDA zone map change that is expected later, and you'll probably see some changes. So more on that when it happens. Two Gals says, my tomato and pepper starts look great. However, the peppers are starting to bloom. I picked off some blooms. Can you chat about topping pepper plants and picking blooms? And so when we have our starts, our peppers and tomatoes and eggplant and whatever else that are growing in pots that we're going to be transplanting outside, when we put them outside, we want to try to reduce the transplant shock as much as possible. And so if the plant has started flowering before we put it outside, the plant is starting to get into survival mode. It's doing fruit. That's what plants do, is they grow their peppers and tomatoes and eggplants. and then we'll get to the end of their life cycle and die. That's what happens with the annual vegetables that we grow in our vegetable gardens. When you put a transplant into the ground, that's shocking the plant in most cases. And so if it already has flowers on that plant, it really gets into survival mode at that point. It's shocked. It's like, oh my God, I'm dying. I got to put more flowers on. And that's great. But what is happening is it's not sending out more roots. It's not often growing into a big, beautiful plant. It's in fruit production mode. And so if it doesn't have that root development, and if it doesn't have all the sturdy stems developed, you're going to end up with a weaker plant and weaker fruit and probably a pretty small harvest. So it's a great idea to pinch off those flowers before you put the plant in the ground. And once it gets in the ground, that shock is going to send, or to tell it to send out more flowers. Go ahead and pinch off those flowers too. And then while all that's happening, roots will be growing and the plant will become more established. So I typically, with my peppers, specifically per the question, when I put my pepper plants in the ground, anything that shows up in the first week and a half to 2 weeks, I'll pinch off those flowers because I want the energy of that plant growing into root production and stem production and leaf production. I want that plant growing. After a couple weeks, now if the plant starts sending out the flowers, I let the flowers go. I can't extend it too long because my season's just too short. And so at about the 2 week point, whatever flowers appear, that's going to be the first fruit that I have on the plant. And that works pretty well for me, is letting the plant get established in its new home as I pinch off those blooms that are starting. The peppers, I've been doing a little bit of research on this over the winter as to whether you actually pinch off the growing tips of the pepper plants, which will stimulate more side branches to grow. So if you pinch the growing tips of peppers, you'll get a bushier plant, more side branches. And so far, what I'm finding is it's not that big a difference overall. When you pinch off that tip that would grow and would send out a flower and would give you fruit, you're now forcing the plant to send out those side branches. And so you're delaying the harvest. So if you have a long season and you want a big bushy pepper plant, go ahead and pinch those tips and get those side branches, and then you'll get the flowers and the fruit. But for a shorter season like I have, by pinching off those tips, by topping the pepper plants, you're delaying the flowers and the fruit, and you may not get to the point where you have fully ripe fruit before your season ends. So I don't top my pepper plants. My season just isn't long enough because I have to wait so long to get the plants in the ground because it's so cool here, and because I'm pinching off those flowers in the first couple weeks. And so it's going to be, for me, the end of June or beginning of July before my pepper plants even are allowed to flower. And so I'm growing plants like early jalapeno that don't take very long because I can get a harvest from them. If I try growing bell peppers, I don't have a lot of success with bell peppers because my season usually isn't long enough to reach the point for that big bell pepper be fully ripe before the frost hits. So those are some thoughts about it, probably more than you were looking for on the topic of the pepper topping, but I hope that helps out, that there's a lot to that, more than just pinching off the flowers and seeing what happens from that point on. So let's see, I'm going to scroll down. I know I got way behind on some of this. Laura's saying, I'm in zone 5B, but last December we had a night that got down to minus 33 Fahrenheit. That's about minus 36 Celsius. Should I start treating this area as zone 3 or 4 instead? And so, yes and no. And it all depends. So the whole point of the hardiness zones is the perennial plants, the fruit bushes, the trees, those type of things that are growing in our landscape. And I've said this in a few previous videos. For those type of plants, so for me, when I put my fruit trees in, I'm in zone 5, and I bought fruit trees that were hardy down to zone 4 because of exactly what you talk about. We're talking about a 30-year meteorological average, and it's going to get colder than that average, and it's going to be hotter than that average. That's how we mathematically arrive at an average. So what I do is exactly what you're suggesting. I get plants, those long-term plants that are hardy to at least one zone colder. And I've had pretty good success with that. When I buy a fruit tree or a fruit bush that is zone 5B, about half the time it doesn't survive more than 3 or 4 winters because we can get some really cold temperatures here in Colorado. So I wouldn't necessarily treat your whole garden as a zone 3 or a zone 4, Laura, but for selective plants that are right on the edge, and and it's a big purchase item. It's one of those investments like a fruit tree. If you're going to be spending a lot of money on a plant, I would err towards one that is hardier. If you're talking about perennial flowers and grasses that are relatively easy to replace at not a great cost, then it's not as important, because if the plant dies in the winter, maybe you've saved seeds and you can replace it with the plants you grow yourself, or you go down to the nursery and replace that plant. So there is that factor, that economic factor, to bring into the discussion as well. And you may not need to totally rethink the zone in your garden, but that's the approach I take with my plants that cost more and would be more difficult to replace. Colorado Bird Nerd, always nice to have you here on Monday. Thank you for that contribution. It's always appreciated, and it's always so nice to have you here and start your Monday with me start your Monday with you. It's so nice to have you here and have that. So thank you so much. So Jay Dixon says, Brian Siebert just generously donated 10 channel memberships. Thank you so much, Brian. And a shout out to Sunset Gazing. I saw Sunset Gazing gave a couple memberships before the show started. So that's just fantastic. The membership of the channel, you'll see a join button if you're watching this on a computer. There's a link in the description if you're watching it on a mobile device. But yes, you can join the channel membership at a couple different levels with different perks at the different levels. And Brian is a fantastic guide that has donated on a regular basis, and thank you as well to Sunset Gazing, who is also donating some of those memberships to others so they can join the community. It is a fantastic group, and I know many of you are part of that group as well, so fantastic. Colorado Bird Nerd says, as kids, my dad, who was a welder, welded a tall nubby jack in the beanstalk pole so we could see how high we could get the bean vines to grow. I always have a bean pole in the garden in his memory. Oh, that's a wonderful memory. I like that. I like those kind of things in the garden, the hardscape, the decorative components that go beyond the plant. And that's definitely a special one. And that's the one that can be passed on to other generations as well. So thank you for sharing that. That's a wonderful idea. And it's got me thinking about some of those kind of things that I want to do as well. Selfith says, I'm growing early jalapeno, king of the North Bell, which are supposed to be good for northern gardeners, and Tabasco in pots so I can bring them indoors to lights if I need to. And great idea. So as we talk about delaying our planting, and I'm actually thinking about doing that as well. I've got a couple grow bags all ready to go. And I've been thinking, I wasn't going to, but I'm thinking about putting some peppers in those grow bags this year for that exact reason, because it's such a late start and who knows when my first frost is going to come. I just hate having those peppers that are ready to ripen on the plant and then the frost hits. So great suggestion to grow them in containers because you can bring them inside when that cold threatens later in the season. So I'm only doing it a couple times. I'm still doing the beds as a primary way. You'll be seeing in videos to come, I'm going to be using my greenhouse to grow a lot of peppers as well for the same reason, just to get that protection and to get what I can. And they add, of course, a few shishito peppers, thanks to Gardener Scott telling us all about them. Yes, I don't have as many shishito peppers as I had hoped. I saved the seeds from my shishito peppers, and that's what I sowed. And I got about 50 or 60% germination. So I didn't get as many plants as I had originally hoped for. And now I'm trying to decide where I'm going to put those plants. And I'm going to put a couple in my green stock, and I think I'll put a couple in the greenhouse. And I think I might put a couple downstairs in my hydroponics because I want to give my shishito pepper plants as much chance as possible to provide me those delicious peppers. And if one of those fails, I've got backup because they really are delicious and something that I think a lot of us should be trying to grow. So let's see, Lyandra Naramani. Hi, I have a question. My friend was growing chili seeds. I got to seedlings about a week ago, but now they died. Is it too late to start again from Ireland? So this ties in exactly with what we were just talking about. So I would say yes, generally, if you were to try to start them again and then put them out into the garden, not knowing your specific climate, but what a little I do know about Ireland, it might be too late. So think about growing them in containers, as we were just talking about. It's not too late for that. Go ahead and start those seeds, get those plants growing. And if you grow those plants in a container, in a pot, in a bucket, in a grow bag, you can extend the season by just bringing them indoors. For most of us, it's the nighttime temperatures that are going to kill the plants 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months from now. And so if we can protect those plants at night, we can keep our season growing because the daytime temperatures will be warm enough. So try growing your chili seeds in a container that you can grow outside. It'll enjoy the nice warm sun and the warm nights while you still have them. And then later in the season, when the nights start getting too cool for those plants, bring them inside overnight, then put them back outside during the day. And if you do that, then it's not too late. You should be able to reach the point that you can continue growing those chili plants and have success with it. It's a lot of work, in and out, but that's the way to extend the season when the plants die before you can get them in the ground, or when the weather doesn't cooperate like is happening for many of us, and we need to figure out a way to grow our garden when it's just reached the point that's later than normal. And that's really the key. If it's later than normal, then you got to act outside your normal comfort zone to be able to have that success. So Sherry's saying, years ago, an editor of Organic Gardening very successfully overwintered pepper plants in his garage. They're perennials after all. Yeah, and I'm going to be experimenting with that. That's why I start thinking about doing the peppers in pots, because I want to try to overwinter some peppers here in my Zone 5 garden. Peppers will grow for years, and they'll get big, and those stems will get thick and woody, and the plant will come back every year. And you just have to protect it during the winter months. And for many of us, it just gets too cold in the winter months. So my plan is to actually grow it in pots when the temperatures start to cool. And if it works, I'll of course be showing you all this in a video. And you do some really severe pruning and then bring it into a cool location. And that's how you can overwinter it. So I haven't seen that article from Organic Gardening, but there's a number of them out there, and that's a great idea to overwinter your peppers. And then you put them outside, and the next year you have just an amazing harvest because the plant's already got that root development. It can start putting its energy into the flower and the fruit production, and it can actually work out pretty well. So Pepper Chris says, I just found my sister does soil testing in our university score. And I think that's what you were trying to say. So good. Soil testing, as many of you know, is a huge, huge thing that you can do for your garden. If you find out what your garden soil is, it can really save you a lot of effort when it comes to fertilizing and amending and choosing the plants you grow. And so if you've got a sister that's doing soil testing, take advantage of that. Absolutely. Okay, let's see. I want to try to catch up to where we were. Sometimes I can get talking about a subject and then lose sight of where we were, like Yankee Sister Homestead, one of my favorite people. Nice to see you here on this Monday. Wonderful, heartfelt live today, Gardener Scott. May peace and love continue to grow in all of our gardens. Blessings and blessings to you, my friend. It's so nice. And so our secret project that will become public, I'm trying to have it all done, not this week, but next week. So maybe I'll talk more about that in next week's live stream. But always so nice to have you here, and thank you for contributing to the channel as well. Bill Will Dog 82, slugs and birds are having a heyday with my bean seedlings. Any home remedies you suggest until I get paid? And so traps are among the most effective way of dealing with slugs and snails. And you've probably seen the bury a little margarine container or a tuna can and fill it with beer. That does work. And they'll crawl into it and they'll drown and it'll kill them. But some of the really more effective ways, if you got a really big slug problem, is to take wet cardboard, and if you can figure out where they might be coming from, you put the wet cardboard on your pathway and they'll crawl underneath that wet cardboard. And so in the morning, you just go out and lift up the wet cardboard and it'll probably be covered with slugs and snails. You can take newspaper, for those of us who still get newspapers, roll it up so that there's a space in the middle that they can crawl into, and wet that, and they'll crawl into the middle of that newspaper, and then you just pick it up and toss it into your trash. The idea is you want to create a wet environment for them to crawl into in that trap. And then, like with the newspaper, it's an easy trap to throw away. You can take old carpet remnants, the same thing. Put a piece of carpet down in your pathway, or if you have open space in your bed, wet it, and they'll crawl underneath that. And you just peel it up and can either squish them and throw them in your compost pile or drop them in a bucket of soapy water, whatever your method is for killing them. But but traps are really among the most effective way. And I think that's so much easier. I've seen some of the same info you may have seen about putting copper strips around the plants, and there's mixed results from some of those copper tests as to whether they really work or not. Putting bait down may or may not work, but the traps is a great way to do it. And then if you really want to get a slug-free garden, get ducks. Ducks are among the most avaricious, that's not the word I was looking for, voracious eaters of slugs. And they don't eat your plants. So you can put a chicken in the garden, and a chicken will eat your plant and eat the slug. But if you put a duck in your garden, it's not going to eat your plants, but it's going to eat your slugs. So a couple ideas there. But yeah, the traps are really the easiest way to do it. Until you get paid, just take some old cardboard or some newspaper and lay it out there wet overnight, and then go in the morning, and I bet you'll see that you have a bunch of slugs that you've captured, and you might be able to decrease that problem. Keep your fingers crossed. Hope, faith, love, fabulous. I overwintered my peppers last year, and now they are fruiting. Awesome. In zone 7B. I'll do it again this fall. I also do the same with my moringa and Colomandan orange. So great. 7B is a cutoff zone where it's a little bit easier. Those in zone 6, it's a little bit harder. Zone 5 is a little bit harder still, but it's still completely doable. And so you've saved your plant this year, you'll save it next year. You can save it for many years to come, and I expect that you'll continue to have success with it. So fantastic. Keep doing that. Dusty Flat says, yikes, I figured out what a vole is, and we have some. They're awful. Never had them, but they're getting evicted ASAP. I know where bulbs went now. Yeah, I think I've told this story in the past. My wife came in and told me that she had rescued a mouse that had fallen down into one of the window wells, and it turns out it was a vole. So she felt really bad that she rescued a vole, because for many of us, they look like little mice. And little mice don't often create near the problem that a vole can create. So sorry to hear that. I hope your vole problem can be fixed. My voles are taken care of pretty much by a local cat. I haven't seen any vole indication in a year or two now, and I know a cat has come in and dealt with them. Mala takes care of the mice, and she takes care of the rabbits. And if she saw a vole, she would take care of the vole. But I haven't seen any vole indication, so keep your fingers crossed that my problem has been dealt with due to the animals in the area that like to hunt the voles. So that's a big deal. In the Garden with Eli and Kate says, I'm trying nematodes for slugs this year. That's a good suggestion. I know that Eli and Kate have a big problem with slugs as well, and they've lost a lot of plants. Nematodes, the thing about nematodes is there are different types of nematodes for different problems. And so nematodes will live in the soil, and depending on what your problem is, you can often find a nematode to deal with that specific problem. Problem being a pest, in this case slugs. So I'm sure they'll be telling us how that works in a future video of their own. I'm interested in hearing about it as well. It's one of those things that if you have a problem and you figure out an easy way to deal with it, shout it to the world, because we all want to know about it as well. Mazzioli says, I overwintered jalapenos this year. I dug them out, washed the roots, put in pots, and they're already growing peppers in Zone 6, Ohio. That's fantastic. That was some of the research I saw, is exactly that, where you dig them up and do that severe pruning and cleaning and then putting them into pots to overwinter. So thank you for sharing that, because I'm looking forward to doing it as well. And you're exactly right. That's, in my Zone 5 garden, it's been so cold this winter for so long that the soil just hasn't warmed up enough to put my plants out in my beds. But if I had a pepper growing in a pot that I'd overwintered, it would be outside every day, because our daytime temperatures are definitely warm enough. And I would love to have a pepper plant that's already fruiting. My pepper in my grow tent is fruiting, but I want outside plants to be growing. That's what it's all about. So, okay, let's see. Sonia Moran says, my year-old Ronde Denise squash died. I got so many squashes off that lady. I'm so glad I planted more from her seed. I'm in zone 9B, Central Florida. It can grow year-round. Yes, you are definitely lucky. And you raise a good point. When we find a plant that we like, that does well, save the seeds. Because you never know when that plant's going to die or when there's going to be a problem. And if you don't have the seeds, you may not be able to recreate that success. So thank you for that example. The squashes are among the easiest to save the seeds from, and especially if you've got one that is successful and you want to keep growing, save the seeds. And that holds true with everything. Tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers. When I finally find a plant that is doing well in my garden, black krim tomato is a perfect example. Black krim just does great in my garden. So I save seeds from the plants that are doing so great in my garden so I can continue to have that success in the future. And I do the same with any other plant that I find that does well. I save the seeds so that I can continue to keep doing that in the future. So Nancy Rudy is saying, hello everyone, hello to you. My garden is Grandpa's garden in memory of all the knowledge he shared with me. That's fantastic. And so I'm not sure if you're just joining us, Nancy, but we were talking earlier about putting up signs and carving rocks. And I've got lots of rocks that have inscriptions on them. And I like that idea of actually at the entrance to the garden putting something like, this is Grandpa's garden, so that others know the space that they're entering into as well. Rev Kai, good morning to you. A bit late, no problem. But I had to repot about 20 little succulents that were broken in a storm last night. Going to have 100 little succulents in a month. So that's great. That's a good reason to miss the beginning of the show, is to be out doing actual garden work. So I think that's fantastic, especially when you've got 100 succulents and in the days ahead to be able to do it. In the Garden with Eli and Kate is crossing fingers about the black krim. So for those of you who haven't seen those videos, Eli and Kate and I have done a couple videos, and there are more videos to come. We're actually working on one right now about the tomatoes that we're growing in our respective gardens. And they have black krim that they're going to be growing in Scotland because my black krim does so well in Colorado. So it's going to be interesting to compare our results at the end of the season and see how it works for both of us in the varieties we've chosen and in the methods that we're growing. So another video is coming, and of course there will be a few more in the future as well. So, and looking forward to that. Hope Faith Love Fabulous has a question. Can you save seeds of tomatoes when you have different kinds of them next to each other? Absolutely. So beans, peppers, tomatoes, these are plants that it's easy to remember, I think. It's perfect flower. Not all plants have it. And so by a perfect flower, when it comes to pollination, both the male and the female part of the pollination is all in the same flower. When we talk about squashes, you have a male flower and you have a female flower. But when we talk about the tomato flower, it's a single flower with both the male and the female parts inside of it. And so it's a difference between monoecious and dioecious plants. And so when it comes to the tomatoes, you don't really have to worry about cross-pollination. If the wind blows, that flower is going to be pollinated. If you brush against it, that flower is going to be pollinated. And 99.9% of the time, I just made up that number, I haven't seen it anywhere, but that's my experience. The tomato flower is going to pollinate itself before an insect comes in to pollinate it, or before the possibility of cross-pollination exists. So I grow my black krim right next to the black cherry, which I grow right next to the Kellogg's breakfast. Those are 3 different tomato plants that I've grown side by side, and I've saved the seeds from each of those plants and then grown those plants the next year, and it's given me the same plant. So I have never worried and won't worry about cross-pollinating the tomatoes, because it almost always will give you the exact same fruit that you were hoping for when you saved the seed. So as far as the pollinators, now it's possible to get a cross-pollination, but just unlikely when it comes to tomatoes. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. And there have been years that I've grown 25 different types of tomatoes, saved seeds of 4 or 5 of them, and then grown those seeds in subsequent years with no problems whatsoever. So you can have a whole bunch of different varieties of tomatoes and still not run into a problem like that. So, and there's Jay with my video on how to collect tomato seeds. So thank you for that, Jay. I appreciate that. They take a little bit extra work to save the tomato seeds, but it's easy to do. And of course, I have a video about it. I did want to say before I forget, this is a picture I took of my garden in the background here today. So my garden is greening up. I've got all of my fruit bushes that made it through the winter, and I actually have a lot of flowers on some of them. And so I'm looking forward to making some jams and jellies if we can get through some of these hailstorms that have been knocking some flowers off. But I just wanted to share this today. I'll get back to some of the other backgrounds that some of you have sent to me in the weeks ahead. But I'm just so happy to see green in my garden after brown for so long. It just feels good. And I put up a hummingbird feeder yesterday hanging from my archway. I have birds that are living in my bird houses with the little baby birds chirping away. And so my garden is alive. It is awake. And particularly in the winter months, sometimes you wonder if you're going to get to that point. Well, I'm at that point. I just need to get my garden in the ground. We need it a little bit warmer. But I just wanted to share some green just because it's so nice to actually have green returning in my garden, which is why it's such a happy space that I can go into and wear myself out while working in the garden. And I have been doing a lot of wearing myself out in the garden lately. So Willie Weed says, love to bury my tomato plants 12 to 18 inches deep to support fruits. So that's deep. I will bury my plants deep. I think the deepest I've gone is maybe 8 inches. So that's a pretty big hole. Good for you that you can actually have a plant that will go down that deep, and you can dig down that deep. In my raised beds, even my tallest beds, I'm not going down that deep because I've got wood buried at the bottom, but that's a nice option if you can. So, and Jay, of course, is sending the reminder, send an image to Gardener Scott at gardenerscott.com. A larger file is better if you embed your photo in the text or in the message. Sometimes that photo doesn't come out. And so you may have sent me a photo in the past and thought, why didn't I show it? Well, sometimes it's how you send it. If the file just isn't big enough, it doesn't show well in this software that I use to show it as a background. So yes, good point. A larger image is better. Do it in landscape. I've gotten vertical pictures, and it's a beautiful garden in vertical, but I just can't get a good landscape image to do as a background as well. And then definitely tell me that I have permission to use your photo, because I've also received a number of photos. And if you don't say that I have your permission to show it to the public, then I'm not going to do that. So I've gotten a lot of photos over the years that I haven't used, even though they're beautiful garden pictures, because of one of those issues. And I'd love to have your garden in the background. Just try to make sure that it's a big file in landscape with your permission, and then any backstory that you want to share. That's fantastic. So Rick says, sorry to hear about the hailstorm. We had some in Sydney too. Missed my area, can do some serious damage. Yeah, absolutely. So you really can't see it in this picture. On the other side here is my asparagus. And my asparagus spears were already growing. They're just starting to bud and leaf out. And then we had a hailstorm that knocked a lot of those developing leaves off my asparagus. And when you're growing asparagus, you need to let it leaf out because that photosynthesis is needed for the roots for the next year's crop. So I'm a little concerned about my asparagus. I'm hoping it will recover and there will be enough new spears pop up with enough of those leafy fronds that develop to keep my plants going. But I thank you for that, Rick. It's one of those concerns I'm a bit worried about as well. I'm moving forward. Since the garden's just waking up, most of the plants were doing okay. But today, I was going to do it yesterday, but it just got too busy with other projects. I might do it today, but either today or tomorrow, I'm going to put my hail cover over my garden before I put in the peppers and the tomatoes and all the plants that I'm going to try to get to next week. So those of us with hail storms know that we have to deal with that issue, and it really can be a big problem. And all of us have problems in different ways. It's just a question of which one it is that we are dealing with. Robin says, this is a time of year when I wear myself out in our garden, but all the work now makes the garden easier to maintain as the season progresses. Absolutely. That's the way I look at it too, is I'm doing a lot of work now to get it set up so that I can relax a little bit in my garden and enjoy the space in the days ahead. When you get to that point when all you do is just an hour, maybe a little bit more of watering and weeding during a typical day, oh, that's a piece of cake compared to these days that might be 6 or 8 hours in the garden. I like the days when I can just go out and enjoy the garden because it's not much work. So you're exactly right, Robin. Get all the work done now so that you can enjoy it and relax a little bit later in the season. That's what it's all about. Joni says, some of my perennial flowers are coming back that were torn down by a storm. Early potato plantings are full and about to flower. So happy to see green. Yeah, I've got the potato plant that I'm growing in a container that I showed in a recent video is almost ready to flower. And that's always a nice sign when the potato plants are flowering. So absolutely one of those things to look forward to. Jenny says, try panorama mode for taking pictures. It's under more on your phone. You can move sideways and get a long horizon in one shot, for example. I take pics of the oceans like that. Yeah, I love taking panorama pictures of my garden. It doesn't necessarily work well for a background. When I put panorama pictures into this program, I have to crop it. I have to choose which part of the panorama is going to end up showing. But for your own album and for your own enjoyment, yeah, panorama view of the garden is really, I like to do that at the height of summer. Just stand in the garden, and for most cameras, when you do a panorama, you're actually moving the camera around the garden, and so you can see it from left to right in one image. And I love doing that when the garden's at its peak. So great suggestion. Panorama pictures in the garden, and especially if you do that year after year, you can really see what's happening in your garden from one season to the next. And I love comparing photos from one season to another. And it also brings back memories. There are plants I'll grow one year, or especially those trees as they grow. A great way to really relive some of those memories is through some of those photos that you can use to document what's happening. Big Will Dog 82, I've already started 2 hot compost piles that have cooled. Been trying to warm them up again with cool crop remains. Any advice? So there's a few reasons why a compost pile will cool. It's because the food has already been eaten, and usually it's the nitrogen that really gets that heat going. Or the pile's drying out, so you need to moisten it, or there's not enough oxygen. And so those are really the big 3 things that can affect, well, I take it back. Or 4, the compost is done and it's ready to use. And so If you have a cooling pile, what you're doing, adding cool crop remains, that's a nitrogen component, that's good, but work that into the pile to introduce oxygen. So get out with your garden fork or whatever you use to turn your pile and introduce oxygen. And as you're doing that, make sure that the pile is moist enough. You may need to add water. So often just turning the pile, fluffing up the pile, adding a little bit of nitrogen and a quick water is enough to get the pile heated again. If it doesn't heat again, it might be because it is it's done, and the only food that's in it is these cool crop remains, and that may not be enough to generate enough heat. So take a look at those factors, see if that helps. But the oxygen, the food, and the water will make a big difference to get that big boost of temperature that you're looking for. Mazzioli has a question about green stock. I just got my mom and I one each in the Mother's Day sale. I filled them with Fox Farms Ocean Forest and Happy Frog mix. Seems to be hydrophobic. Yes, so it's a great mix. I love Ocean Forest and Happy Frog. And so they are hydrophobic because they'll either be using the cocoa coir or the peat moss, and that is what makes it hydrophobic. Hydrophobic means that it repels water. And so what I like to do is actually soak my mix in a container before I put the mix into a pot or the green stock, so that it's been sitting in the water, and that will help it absorb and not be hydrophobic. What you can do now is just do light watering in your green stock every hour, every other hour, 3 times a day, whatever time you have. But go ahead and water it. Some of that will soak in. Water it again. Some of that will soak in. Water it again. Some of that will soak in. And it might take a few days, but that's one way to get those ingredients to gradually soak up the water. And then once that coir or peat has absorbed the moisture, it'll stay wet. It's not as likely to dry out quickly. It can just take a while before it gets to that point. And so if you've ever seen one of those blocks of cocoa coir, you put it into a tub and you pour water on it, and the water just flows right off of it. It's hydrophobic. But if you let it sit in that water for a couple hours, it swells up and it becomes moist and stays moist. I've got some of that from a block that I re-moisturized 3 months ago now, maybe 4 months, and it's still wet. I haven't added any water to it since I first got it wet, and it stays wet. And so you just got to get to that point, and that may mean a lot of watering on a regular basis before you put the plants in. If you already put the plants in, you may need to do more watering because the plants are probably going to suffer until you can get all of that mixed up again. So hope that helps out. In the future, if you can, try to moisten the mix before you put it in the container, and that can save you a lot of concern about the hydrophobic materials that are inside of it. So the green stock, I've been doing that with my green stock because I don't water, I leave them outside and I don't water them during the winter. And so I've been watering my green stock at least once, sometimes 2 times a day for the last 2 or 3 weeks, so that medium is completely moist, because I'll be putting plants in this week in my green stock. And so I started wetting that long before I put plants in, because once it dries out, it does stay hydrophobic for a while. So something to think about. So as we end the show today, I encourage you to check out some of those channels that you may not be aware of. Green Side Up is one that I have mentioned in the past. And though Steve is not with us anymore, his videos are. And you can watch his videos and learn so much from his experience. He's got great information on that channel. And he was going to be 58 years old here in just a little more than a month. And so as as an old guy on YouTube, he passed much too soon. And I know that so many of you are sad at his passing, but he lives on, and he lives on through his videos. So I encourage that you check out Green Side Up to remember Steve and to learn from what he had to share with us, because he did have a lot of knowledge and information and experience, and all that comes through in his videos. And the same with all of the other favorites that you have out there on YouTube and in your life. You never know when they're going to be gone. And so live each day, live each moment ready to take advantage of sharing your time with someone else and taking advantage of that other person who's willing to share time with you. That's why I'm planning to drop in on my daughter and granddaughters today, because we don't do it often enough, and we should, but life gets in the way sometimes, and we shouldn't let that stop us from spending time with those of us that mean so much in our lives. And we don't want to get to that point when we're remembering them. We should be living in the moment when we can enjoy them. So that's what I'm doing today. I'm going to be heading off here pretty soon for that visit, and I look forward to seeing the videos from those of you that will also be making some remembrances of Steve from Green Side Up, and all the others in our life that deserve a spot in our heart and in our garden. Thank you so much for being here today. Of course, I'll be back next week. I hope you have a wonderful garden week. And of course, always remember to enjoy gardening.